somewhere in the high desert of eastern California, at an elevation where the wind is ceaseless and snow can fall even in the middle of summer, lies a town the state of California officially describes as being in a state of arrested decay. Not restored, not preserved, arrested. As if the decay itself had been caught mid-act, doing something it wasn't supposed to be doing. And there it remains, frozen, still reaching, suspended in motion. The town is Bodie. Between 1877 and 1882, its population ranged from 7,000 to 10,000, depending on which census taker you believed. And those census takers often didn't survive long enough to finish their counts. In those 5 years, the Bodie morgue handled more deaths per capita than any other settlement in California. The town had 1 church and 65 saloons, a red light district that operated around the clock, a Chinatown, a maiden lane, a brewery, a slaughterhouse, a bank vault robbed so many times the lock was eventually welded shut rather than replaced. Its reputation stretched from San Francisco to Sacramento to the Nevada mining camps, a place where a man could arrive on Monday and be buried by Friday with no report filed. Some of that was exaggeration. Mining towns always cultivated myths of violence. It attracted a certain kind of man, and those men spent money. But some of it, the parts not printed in newspapers, recorded only in coroner's logs or in the private letters of men who fled Bodie and never returned, was worse than the rumors suggested. Things happened in Bodie that the official record buried, not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. Connections between men of influence that they could not afford to have exposed. What we know of Bodie today is largely what was permitted to survive. Before we go further into the story of Bodie, what it cost to build, to break, and to bury, take a moment to subscribe to Forgotten Stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. While you're there, drop a comment telling us where you're listening from. We read every single one. And tonight, we want to know who's out there in the dark with us. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Not the version in tourist brochures, but the real one. The one that started not with gold, but with a man named Waterman Bodie, a blizzard, and a decision that never should have been made. The eastern Sierra Nevada in the late 1850s was not a place that welcomed settlement. The mountains rise abruptly from the Great Basin, and the terrain between them, high desert valleys, alkali flats, volcanic tablelands, has a hostility early settlers often described not as dangerous, but indifferent. The land didn't want to kill you. It simply didn't care whether you lived or died. And in that indifference, it killed many. At 300 feet above sea level, in the volcanic highlands east of the main Sierra crest, the seasons were not what men from the eastern states or Europe recognized. Winter came not in December but October, sometimes September. It didn't depart until May, sometimes June. Snow came sideways, driven by winds that had crossed hundreds of miles of open desert with nothing left to stop them. January temperatures could hit 30 below zero Fahrenheit before wind chill. The landscape offered no shelter, no deep forests, no sheltered valleys, just high, flat, open terrain. Whatever lived there did so in full exposure to whatever the sky decided. The Paiute had lived in the region for centuries and understood its rhythms. Where water could be found in summer, where game moved in winter. How to read the sky when the temperature plunged 40 degrees in an afternoon. They called the volcanic highlands names that roughly translated to the place of difficult passage and where the wind has no mercy. These weren't poetic, they were practical. They moved through this country with the knowledge of people who had learned over generations which parts could sustain life and which could not. They knew the basin where Bodie would stand was not a place to winter. Their ancestors had tried, and they told their descendants what it cost. The men who arrived in the 1850s seeking gold did not speak Paiute. Most wouldn't have listened if they did. William Bodie, whose name, through misspelling and misremembering, would become the name of one of California's most notorious towns, arrived near Mono Lake in the summer of 1859. A prospector from Poughkeepsie, New York, he had spent most of his adult life chasing something just over the next ridge. He'd been in California since 1849, following the original rush. By 1859, he was 41, trail-worn, and running low on capital and patience. He had tried the Mother Lodes rivers, the gravel bars of the American, Feather, and Trinity rivers. He worked for wages in the Northern Sierra's hydraulic operations, saved enough to strike out a loan, then lost it on a claim that yielded nothing. He started again. Men like Bodie were the majority of California's mining population by the late 1850s. Not those who struck it rich in '49, but those who followed the legend and found only diminishing returns from a rush already past its peak. They were patient in the way men become patient when their alternatives are worse. Bodie had partners, as most prospectors did, names the historical record treated with less care than his. One was called Black Taylor, possibly born into slavery and freed before reaching California, depending on the source. Another was a French-Canadian, known in some records as Doré, in others simply as the Frenchman. Both were experienced in high-country prospecting, placer panning in summer streams, assessing quartz outcroppings, calculating whether a promising sign justified the labor to follow it deeper. In late July 1859, Bodie, Taylor, and Doré discovered placer gold in a ravine about 80 miles north of Mono Lake. The amount was unspectacular, enough to confirm a vein, not enough for instant riches. But in the exhausted arithmetic of late-stage California prospecting, it was enough. The color in the pan was consistent. The rock suggested something beneath the surface that surface samples couldn't reveal. In the trade's language, it was a showing, a reason to look further. Bodie recorded the claim, sent word south, began planning. He didn't survive to execute them. In November 1859, Bodie and a companion named Esk, a younger man from Ohio who had attached himself to the party in summer, willing if not particularly skilled, set out from their winter camp to retrieve supplies from a settlement in the valley below. They delayed the journey too long, waiting for a break in the weather that came briefly, then closed again before they reached safety. A storm came from the north faster than expected. Esk survived by finding shelter in a stand of pinyon pines, building a fire from deadfall, and feeding it through the night as wind drove temperatures to painful lows. Bodie didn't. He was found the following spring frozen, less than half a mile from camp. He had made it nearly far enough. The camp was visible from where he lay, a fact everyone noted, true and terrible. He was buried near the discovery site in an unmarked grave. His partners misspelled his name on the claim documents, by accident or carelessness, with the same effect as intention. The place became Bodie, not Bodie. A slight, meaningless distortion that felt apt for a town that would spend the next 20 years distorting everything it touched. For almost 2 decades after Bodie's death, the Highland claims changed hands without yielding much. Small operations came and went. Men staked, dug, gave up, moved on. The land around the original discovery remained largely unworked, deeper veins untouched beneath volcanic soil, while men chose easier country. Winters drove most operators out, supplying an operation at that elevation on roads impassable 5 months of the year made margins on low grade or impossible. The Standard Mine Company, incorporated in San Francisco in the early 1870s by men with financial, not geological, expertise, kept a small crew on the property without serious expectation of return. The kind of investment wealthy men made when they had money to lose and a theory, about what the rock might contain. Then, in 1876, a mine shaft collapsed. The Standard's operations had included exploratory shafts driven at various angles and depths, following what the company's geological advisor, a San Francisco man who visited twice a year and spent the rest in an office, believed were promising structural indicators. One shaft, the eastern one, had been driven deeper than authorized because the on-site foreman, a practical man from Ohio named Gideon Frey, had a feeling. Based on the rock's color, the angle of quartz intrusions, and the temperature drop as he went deeper, an indicator, in that part of the Sierra, of high-grade ore, Frey's feeling proved correct. The collapse of the eastern shaft in autumn 1876, which killed 2 men, exposed a vein of gold, bearing quartz, that assayed at values that made the company's owners pale. Not with fear, but with the shock of sudden, almost incomprehensible wealth. The numbers were checked twice. They were confirmed. By spring 1877, word was out, and the men began arriving. In 1878, Bodie had between 4,000 and 6,000 people, growing by hundreds each month. The Standard and Bodie mines produced ore at rates justifying every superlative the San Francisco papers could manufacture. The Bodie Bank processed more gold dust in a single week than some counties in a year. Main Street's commercial district stretched half a mile, wooden storefronts pressed so tightly together that a fire at one end would consume everything before a man could reach the other. They had 2 fires in 1878. Neither was the last. The town had grown faster than its bones could support. Streets existed because men walked through mud often enough to create ruts, which became roads, which attracted buildings without plan or logic. Water came from a hillside spring through a pipe that froze solid every winter, so from November to March, the town melted snow in barrels near stoves, a laborious, ineffective process, as barrels were rarely clean and snow was rarely free of wind-blown debris from the volcanic flats. Sanitation was, charitably, provisional. In summer, the smell from alleys behind the commercial district reached the residential hills, and men who had grown up with sewers wrote home in terms their families found too extreme to believe. Bodie's violence during its peak was not merely anecdotal. It was structural. More than 60 establishments sold alcohol, an opium trade, a gambling economy, and a floating population of men with no stake in the community's future, because they didn't expect to stay long. The justice system was a sheriff whose jurisdiction was Mono County, but who was 30 miles away in Bridgeport. A town marshal replaced 8 times in 4 years for corruption, incompetence, or death, and a justice of the peace who held court above a saloon, his rulings enforced or not depending on whether the defendant's friends were better armed than the plaintiffs. To live in Bodie in 1878 was to exist in continuous low-level alarm. The town had no real night. Saloons ran until dawn, mills ran around the clock. Their stamps pounding ore in a rhythm residence eventually stopped hearing, like a clock in a room they'd occupied too long. Those sounds included, with regularity that ceased to be remarkable, gunshots, sometimes distant, sometimes close, sometimes followed by shouting, boots on wooden floors, and the particular silence that followed sudden violence in a space full of men deciding whether to involve themselves. Newspapers of the era, local and in San Francisco, covered Bodie's violence with something that looked like horror, but was actually commercial enthusiasm. Stories of shootings sold papers. Stories of robberies sold papers. The town had cultivated a reputation, exaggerated, but rooted in enough truth to remain the most dangerous settlement in California, attracting a certain kind of man and repelling the kind of families that might have stabilized it. The story of Patrick Fahey, which circulated in the California press in summer 1879, sold many papers, then, with unusual speed, stopped being mentioned at all. Fahey was 34 in 1879. He had come from Virginia City, Nevada, where he'd worked as a shift supervisor in the Comstock mines long enough to save money, then lost it in a speculation he refused to discuss. He arrived in Bodie in spring 1878 with nothing but his tools, his experience, and a reputation among mining men as someone who understood geology with uncommon precision. The kind who could look at a rock face and describe what it was doing 50 feet beyond where the candle reached. He was a quiet, private man by accounts of those who knew him. He didn't frequent saloons, didn't gamble, attended no church, which in 1878 Bodie meant he joined the majority. Irish, born in County Clare, raised in Philadelphia, shaped by a combination of Catholic sensibility and American practicality characteristic of Irish American men who came of age after the famine. He took notes. This was unusual enough that his colleagues remarked on it. He carried a leather-bound notebook, small enough for his coat pocket, thick enough for months of observations, recording rock dimensions, or intrusion angles, temperature and air quality at different depths, and discrepancies between what he observed and the official maps. At first, these were normal, minor variations between idealized maps and rock's irregular reality. But the discrepancy Fahey found in late summer 1879 was not ordinary. He hired on at the Standard Mine and became shift foreman within 6 months, a significant advancement for a man without local connections. His supervisors, especially the superintendent, Calvin Pratt, who had come west from Pennsylvania with a mining engineering degree from a now defunct school and managed operations with technical competence and political sophistication that kept investors satisfied and miners from organizing, recognized Fahey's practical knowledge and used it. Fahey knew where the ore was. Pratt, despite his education, couldn't replicate it. The problem was Fahey also knew other things. In early autumn 1879, Fahey wrote a letter, partially preserved because a portion was entered into a county proceeding only partially kept. He described, in careful language, what he'd found in the Standard Mine's eastern shaft lower levels. Evidence that ore samples from a particular section had been systematically underreported. Not by accident, but deliberately, in a pattern running at least 2 years, diverting a significant sum from public shareholders to unknown parties. The letter was addressed to a San Francisco lawyer named Emmett Corcoran, who represented a consortium of Standard Mine investors. Corcoran received it. He later said so in deposition, but didn't immediately act, wanting to verify claims before presenting them to clients. Patrick Fahey didn't give him time. On the night of October 14, 1879, Fahey was found dead in the alley behind the Occidental Hotel on Main Street. The alley was one of the narrow service passages, behind commercial buildings, used during the day by delivery men, and at night by men who preferred not to use front entrances that implied a public commitment they weren't prepared to make. Dark, no gas lighting, light from saloon windows didn't reach around corners. The cold was the particular dry, sharp, odorless cold of an October in the eastern Sierra, a wrongness of its own. The official findings shot during a robbery. His wallet and watch were missing. The town marshal, Rufus Strand, opened an inquiry. No arrests, closed within 3 weeks. The San Francisco papers ran the story for 2 days, then nothing. What they didn't run, what no paper ran, though several journalists later claimed awareness, was that Fahey hadn't been carrying his wallet that night. His landlady, Agnes Corrigan, a widow who ran the Fuller Street rooming house, where Fahey had boarded for 14 months, told the inquest Fahey left his wallet in his room because he'd said he was only walking to the assay office and back. She'd seen him go, noted he seemed preoccupied, not frightened, but carrying something too large to set down. He carried only his notebook. The leather, bound one for geological observations, which, unlike the wallet and watch, was never found. The notebook is the detail that keeps surfacing. Corrigan told the inquest about it. The inquest noted and moved on. Corcoran mentioned it in deposition, then clarified he'd never seen its contents. A mine worker named Thomas Healy, Fahey's closest associate at the Standard, testified he saw Fahey take notes in that notebook the day of his discovery. Healy left Bodie 3 months later for Oregon, then vanished from the record. The notebook was never found. The inquiry was closed. The Standard mine continued operating. In spring 1880, Calvin Pratt purchased a substantial house in San Francisco's Nob Hill, a number that didn't align with a superintendent's salary, even a generous one. No one asked him publicly about it. The years between 1880 and 1882 were Bodie's apex. The Standard mine alone produced millions in gold during those 2 years, and the town reached what contemporaries called its fullest and most terrible flower. A phrase from a Methodist minister named Elias Drummond, who arrived in summer 1880 to establish a congregation and spent most of the next year writing letters to his bishop that grew progressively desperate. Drummond's letters, survived in their entirety, are one of the most vivid first-person accounts of Bodie at its peak, not because he was a skilled observer, but because he was genuinely shocked and hadn't learned to moderate it. He described the streets at night as a continuous corridor of noise and ruin, with light from 60 doorways making a kind of counterfeit noon. Men passing in states of intoxication, so profound they appeared to navigate not a street, but some internal landscape. He described the cemetery on the hill above town, Boot Hill, though he refused the name, as filling at a rate troubling not only morally but practically. There is beginning to be a problem of space, he wrote in October 1880. He wasn't wrong. The Bodie cemetery records, more complete than most surviving documents, list 273 burials between 1877 and 1882. Of those, 61 were gunshot wounds, 49 homicides, 12 accidents, another 37 mining accidents, 18 freezing to leave deaths from exposure to extreme winter temperatures below zero, winds blowing men off horses, 23 illness of pneumonia or fever without specification, and the remaining 41 were labeled cause undetermined. 41 people buried in Bodie whose cause of death was listed as undetermined. In a town where the coroner was also the dentist and the most active gambling parlor operator, and whose official seal appears on documents that sometimes contradict each other. Undetermined could mean what it said. It could mean the determination was inconvenient, or that no one with authority had looked carefully enough. Among the 41 was Dario Lucetti, an Italian from Piedmont who arrived in California in 1875, worked 2 years in Northern Sierra hydraulic mining, then came south to Bodie in 1877. A laborer, not a skilled miner, he did the physical work of breaking and hauling rock. He worked for the Bodie mine, not the Standard, and his employment records, more complete than its competitors for reasons likely legal caution, show him as reliable, uncomplaining, receiving periodic wage increases, never filing a grievance. But he also appears in the private account book of Samuel Obergefell, a merchant who operated a dry goods store on King Street and kept, besides his business ledger, a second notebook for personal debts, favors, and matters he called off-weight, in his ornate mid-century German script. Obergefell's second notebook, discovered in 1923 in a Bridgeport building by a woman clearing her deceased uncle's property, was given to a local historian who transcribed portions before the original was lost. Those transcriptions are held at the Eastern California Museum in Independence. In September 1881, Obergefell's notebook records a conversation with Lucetti, brief, specific. Lucetti had told him something about the Bodie mine's lower tunnels and the matter concerning the Chinese workers and the passage they were made to use. The Bodie mine, like many California operations, employed many Chinese laborers who occupied a separate neighborhood and were assigned the most dangerous work. Tunnels with bad air, low ceilings, unstable walls. This was not unusual for the era, nor illegal under California law, though labor organizations argued it should be. What Luchetti told Obergefell was more specific: a particular passage, a particular use of it, troubling enough that Obergefell wrote it under matters of weight, and did nothing. The next entry records Luchetti's death. Found dead on the morning of March 3, 1882, at the bottom of a shaft in the Bodie mine's eastern section. One, he wasn't assigned to work. The foreman's report suggested he wandered there by accident in pre-dawn darkness and fell. The depth ensured the fall was cause of death. The coroner ruled accidental death, but recorded as undetermined in the cemetery records, a discrepancy never investigated. Obergefell noted, "Luchetti is dead. The matter he described is now, I think, beyond my ability to pursue. I will say no more of it here." He never did. Bodie's decline happened in phases, each feeling like a temporary setback. Ore grades at the Standard and Bodie mines began dropping in 1882, gradually, like a tide going out so slowly you don't notice it's gone until you're standing in mud. Mill runs that produced 20 dollars of gold per ton dropped to 15, then 12, then numbers making San Francisco accountants ask questions Bodie men didn't want to answer. By 1883, population dropped by half. By 1885, half again. Saloons closed one by one, highest rents first, then edges. Chinese laborers with no financial stake left for San Francisco and Sacramento. The red light district contracted to a single street, then a handful of quiet houses. The Bank of Bodie closed in 1884, taking whatever records it kept on mine companies' financial movements. Calvin Pratt had been gone 2 years by then. Resigned in fall 1882, citing personal considerations, returned to his Nob Hill house, living comfortably for the rest of his long life. In an 1891 San Francisco Chronicle interview on his appointment to a new Nevada mining concern, he described his Bodie years as formative and challenging, building character. Asked about violence, he said it had been exaggerated. About Standard mine records, he said they'd been exemplary. He wasn't asked about Patrick Fahey. Emmett Drummond left Bodie in spring 1883, going to Stockton, then Sacramento. In his final ministry years, he gave lectures on mining, town morality that were notable for omissions. Speaking at length about drinking, gambling, violence in abstract terms, never mentioning Fahey, Luchetti, or his private correspondence, which he seems to have burned before his death in 1909. Agnes Corrigan, Fahey's landlady, stayed longer than most, converting her rooming house to a boarding house, then a private residence. She appears in the 1890 census as one of fewer than 300 still resident. She died there in 1897 in a town shrunk to a skeleton, a few dozen holdouts, a mine or two fitfully producing, leaving a small collection of personal effects and a sealed letter addressed to no one. Found among her things by a drifter named Cole Renner, who had arrived for winter work and stayed 6 months. Renner could read, a minority in that labor, and he read the letter before deciding what to do. He ultimately gave it to Ida Sargent, wife of the Mono County recorder, who collected documents from declining settlements. Sargent held it for years, showing it to several people without widely revealing its contents. After her death, it passed to her daughter, then to a historical collection, but which one is unclear, as it appears in 2 separate early 20th century inventories and in neither after 1931. The letter's contents, described by those who read it before it vanished. Corrigan wrote that in the weeks before Fahey's death, he told her something she hadn't repeated at the inquest out of fear, but was writing now because she was old and had no one left to fear. Fahey had found, in the standard mine's eastern shaft lower levels, a secondary passage, unmarked, on no map, connecting to a section designated on internal company documents as an ore processing auxiliary. He had followed it and discovered the auxiliary was not a processing facility but a large, reinforced storage chamber containing machinery Fahey identified as equipment for systematically segregating and diverting high-grade ore before it reached the mill. A skimming operation. High-grade ore was pulled from the rock before weighing and recording, diverted through the secondary passage, processed separately, its value recorded nowhere in the official books. The gold it produced went somewhere. Standard shareholders, many ordinary San Francisco investors, never saw it. Fahey measured it, estimated its scale, recorded it in his notebook, wrote to Corcoran, and 3 weeks later was shot in an alley. His notebook never recovered. Corrigan didn't name the men responsible, but said Fahey had told her the operation required knowledge and cooperation of several people whose names he withheld to keep her safe. She had lived the 17 years since his death with that weight and was tired of carrying it. She ended, "I do not know if this will reach anyone who will do something with it. I suspect it will not. Things like this have a way of becoming old news before they become known news. But I have written it. That is the only thing left that I could do." The fire of 1892 destroyed most of Bodie's remaining commercial district. It started in a building on Green Street in early morning July, in low humidity and high winds, effectively unstoppable once it reached adjacent structures. 63 buildings burned. The population was small enough that everyone watched from a safe distance. No one died. A different miracle than Bodie was accustomed to in its prime. What burned included the Bodie Free Press office, the town's newspaper during its peak, which had accumulated a library of back issues, correspondence, and unpublished materials, all gone by morning. The editor, Frank Overton, running the paper for 15 years on local inertia and stubbornness, told the Bridgeport Chronicle he had lost a file of documents he'd intended to do something with. Asked what they were, he said only, "Things sent to me over the years by people who wanted something done and then thought better of wanting it." He was 71. He died the following winter. Whatever he intended went with him. The 1932 fire, which destroyed another substantial portion of the town, started in a building housing the equipment of the last remaining mining operation, the Rosecliff Company, attempting to extract value from tailings using a new cyanide leaching process. Dangerous in the hands of undercapitalized men, working the wrong season. It burned for 2 days, destroying several buildings that survived the 1892 fire, including the old assay office and the remains of the Standard Mine's administrative headquarters. A historian from Berkeley named Marcus Aldrich, who had studied Bodie since the mid-1920s and visited multiple times to photograph and catalog surviving structures, wrote to a colleague that the 1932 fire had destroyed several items he'd identified as potentially significant, including the contents of a locked room in the Standard building that I had been unable to gain access to, and that the owners had refused to allow me to examine. Aldrich's letter, held in the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, is dated 6 weeks after the fire. The locked room is mentioned nowhere else in Bodie historic site documents. By the 1940s, Bodie's population had dwindled below 20. The last full-time residents left around 1942, driven out by wartime labor demands and the simple mathematics of a town with no economic reason to exist. The buildings remained, the wind kept moving through, the winters kept doing what winters at 300 feet do, settling into wood, working at foundations, finding cracks. The state designated Bodie a state historic park in 1962. The official designation uses arrested decay to describe the preservation philosophy. Buildings maintained in their found condition, continuing their slow deterioration without restoration, stabilized but not renewed, an unusual approach, acknowledging something is falling apart and deciding to let it keep falling apart, just more slowly. The Standard Mine's eastern shaft, where Fahey made his discovery in 1879, is not part of the state park's accessible area. Listed as structurally unsafe, fenced off. Park rangers who have worked at Bodie for extended periods, speaking off the record, have noted the eastern shaft's closure predates any formal structural assessment. They are not aware of any inspection to determine its actual condition. The secondary passage Fahey described, unmarked, connecting to the chamber with skimming equipment, does not appear on any state park map. This could mean many things. 19th century mining maps are notoriously incomplete. Passages were dug and not recorded. Records were lost in fires. The chamber Corrigan described, reinforced, large, housing machinery, would have required significant construction, leaving physical evidence. Stone and timber don't disappear the way paper does. But no one with authority has looked. Just when you think you understand Bodie. A boomtown, a cautionary tale, a place where greed, violence, and desperation ran together as they always did in the mining West. The story reveals another layer. If this gives you chills, share this video with someone who loves dark history. Hit the like button to keep this channel going and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. What happened in those tunnels is only part of what we still need to uncover, because the Standard Mine story didn't end with Pratt's departure or Fahey's death. It had a coda, involving a man who came to Bodie in 1938, nearly 60 years after Fahey's murder, and left without publishing what he found, giving, when asked in his final years, answers that were never quite answers. His name was Bernard Holt, a journalist from Sacramento, not famous, but the kind who spent 30 years writing for regional papers, knowing how to find a story and knowing when it was bigger than he was. He came in summer 1938 as part of his paper's project on California ghost towns, spending 3 weeks there, longer than required, in a tent at the edge of the town site, as buildings were unsafe. What he did those 3 weeks we know from 2 sources. His published article, thorough and accomplished, saying nothing remarkable, and a notebook found among his papers when he died in 1971. His daughter, settling his estate, found the notebook and read it. Recognizing it was different, more careful, more deliberate, written as if he thought someone might read it who wasn't supposed to, she kept it. Holt had found the secondary passage, not the physical shaft, which had partially collapsed by 1938, but documents wedged behind a partially detached panel in the Standard Mine's old administrative office. Damaged by moisture and age, but legible, internal company memoranda from the 1880s discussing what Holt, believing it almost certainly the mine superintendent's writing, called the secondary accounting. Exactly what Corrigan's letter suggested, a parallel record of ore extraction and processing, maintained separately from the official books, recording high-grade material from the eastern shaft through an unmarked passage to a separate processing facility. The memoranda were administrative, not confessional quantities, schedules, personnel arrangements. What the men who operated the secondary facility were paid for their silence, and what happened when the arrangement was threatened. They didn't use Patrick Fahey's name. They used a construction Holt, transcribed directly. The matter of the employee who had been conducting unauthorized surveys of the eastern section. And, in a subsequent document, the resolution of the employee matter. The resolution, as if Fahey's death were a budget line, a murder and administrative outcome. Holt's notebook records that he spent 2 days after finding the documents in something between fear and calculation. He was aware, he wrote explicitly, that the men who had authorized the resolution were dead. Pratt had died in 1914. The others who managed the secondary operation in the intervening years. No living criminal to expose, no case to make to a prosecutor. Only history. What happened, how a man was killed and his discovery buried. 40 years, during which the Standard Mining Company continued operating and its officers prospered, while defrauded shareholders never knew. Holt calculated whether publishing that history served a purpose proportionate to its risks. The men were dead, but they had families. The Standard had been absorbed into other entities, which were absorbed into others still. Mining concerns moving capital through successive corporate containers. There were people, unnamed in the notebook, with financial or reputational interest in the matter remaining buried, and people in positions of authority, also unnamed, who he believed would prefer the story not told. He published the Ghost Town article. Well received, said nothing about the documents. He took the documents, kept them 33 years until his death. His daughter found them with the notebook. She read them, put them back, telling a historian in 1979 she had decided to let her father's decision stand, because he had lived with it longer than I have and he knew things I don't. She died in 1994. The documents and notebook were part of his estate, handled by an attorney whose records aren't publicly accessible. Whether they survive, and in whose possession, is not known. What is known, what the documented record, partial and fragmented, allows us to say with confidence, is this: Patrick Fahey'd something in the Standard Mine's eastern shaft in 1879 that threatened powerful men. 3 weeks later, he was dead. The notebook was never recovered. The men responsible died wealthy and respected. The company continued operating for decades. The fires of 1892 and 1932 destroyed much of the administrative record. A journalist found evidence of the fraud in 1938 and chose not to publish it. The evidence passed out of public reach and hasn't been seen since. And beneath Bodie, in the eastern section of the Standard Mine, in a shaft never formally assessed for the structural safety cited as the reason for its closure, there is a passage that appears on no official map. It is still there. The rock doesn't burn. Today, Bodie receives approximately 200,000 visitors a year. They walk the wooden boardwalks of a town that stopped in 1942 and has been stopping ever since. Slowly, incrementally, in the way things stop when no one decides to stop them. But no one decides to maintain them either. The Standard Mine headframe still stands on the hill above town, visible from the main road as you approach, rising against the eastern Sierra sky with the particular silhouette mining infrastructure has. Functional, angular, stripped of any attempt at beauty. The park's interpretive materials describe Bodie in terms of boom and bust, human ambition and natural forces. A lesson on the transience of wealth. They mention the violence in measured terms, the high death rates, the 65 saloons, the reputation that kept respectable families away. They mention several documented killings, the famous ones, those that made the papers. They do not mention Patrick Fahey. They do not mention Dario Lucetti. They do not mention the 41 people buried in the Bodie cemetery under cause undetermined. There is a docent program, staffed by volunteers who know Bodie's history with an intimacy from years of study. Several of them, in conversations with researchers and journalists over the decades, have mentioned that requests to have the eastern shaft professionally assessed have been met with what one longtime volunteer described as all lack of urgency that I find hard to attribute entirely to budget constraints. The state of California maintains Bodie in arrested decay. The phrase is apt in ways that may not have been fully intended. Decay arrested, caught in the act, stopped before it could complete itself, held in permanent incompleteness, where the ending is always approaching, but never arrives. The buildings lean. The wind works through the gaps. In winter, when the tourists are gone, roads impassable, and the town returns to the silence it had before anyone arrived seeking gold. The only sounds are the wind and settling, timber contracting and cold. The structures remembering, in whatever way structures can remember, what they once contained. The standard mine headframe stands above all of it, standing 140 years through fires, winters, and the slow departure of everything and everyone that once gave it reason to stand. Below, the eastern shaft descends into the dark. The passage goes where it goes. The chamber at the end, if it is still there, holds what it holds. Some things, once buried, resist excavation, not because they are unreachable, but because the people with the power to reach them have decided, generation by generation, that the cost of what they might find is greater than the cost of leaving it where it is. Patrick Fahey knew something. He tried to tell someone. He died for trying. That is not a ghost story. Ghosts are comfortable, things we can dismiss in daylight. This is something else, the record. Partial, damaged, interrupted at every critical juncture by fires, disappearances, and deliberate choices of men who understood exactly what they were doing when they chose silence. This is the shape of what happened when wealth was large enough, men ruthless enough, institutions compliant enough that a murder could be wrapped in the ordinary paperwork of a mining town and left to yellow for a century and a half. Bodie did not refuse to stay dead. It was never allowed to be fully alive, not in the sense of the full accounting, the complete record, the unredacted version of what happened in those shafts, back rooms and alley behind the Occidental Hotel on the night of October 14th, 1879. The town is still there. The shaft is still closed. The passage appears on no map. And somewhere in a collection, an estate, a box, a room unopened since 1994, there are documents a man spent 33 years deciding not to publish and a notebook recording everything he found and feared. This mystery shows us something we would prefer not to know about the past. That the mechanisms of concealment were not exceptional, but ordinary, not the work of unusual evil, but of ordinary self-interest operating in conditions where no one with power had reason to object. What do you think really happened in that eastern shaft? Do you believe everything about Bodie has been told? Or is there a version no one has been permitted to tell? Leave your comment below. But if you enjoyed this and want more stories where the horror is real because the people were real and the choices they made were the choices people actually made, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who thinks they know American history. There are always rooms we haven't looked in yet. We'll see you in the next one.